It was a typical summer afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays over the quiet suburban streets. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and the occasional hum of lawnmowers broke the peaceful silence. 16-year-old Tanya was walking home from the library, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her earbuds firmly in place. She had spent hours poring over textbooks, determined to ace her upcoming science exam. Lost in thought about molecules and chemical reactions, she barely noticed anything around her. As she turned onto her street, something caught her attention, a police car slowly rolling behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just patrolling the area or heading somewhere else, but then the car slowed down even more, almost matching her pace. A voice called out from inside the vehicle, sharp and commanding. "Hey you, stop right there." Tanya froze for a second, unsure what was happening. She pulled out her earbuds and turned toward the sound. The officer stepped out of the car, his uniform crisp under the sunlight. He approached her with a stern expression, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone clipped and suspicious. "I'm just walking home," Tanya replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite feeling uneasy. "I was at the library studying." The officer narrowed his eyes, as if he didn't quite believe her. "Library, huh? You got any ID on you?" Tanya shook her head. "No, sir. I don't usually carry it when I go to the library." She gestured toward her backpack. "But I can show you my books if you want." Instead of easing the tension, her response seemed to make the officer more agitated. He crossed his arms and leaned closer. "You know, we've been getting reports of kids acting suspicious around here lately. Loitering, causing trouble. What's in the bag?" Tanya felt her stomach tighten. Suspicious? Trouble? All she'd done was walk home after spending hours reading. Why was this happening? Still, she tried to stay calm. "Just school stuff," she said, holding up her backpack slightly. "Books, notebooks, nothing else." But the officer wasn't satisfied. His voice grew louder, drawing stares from neighbors peeking through their windows. "Let me see that bag," he demanded, stepping closer. "Now." Tanya hesitated, her heart racing. Something about the way he was speaking to her felt wrong, like she was being accused of something she hadn't done. She remembered hearing stories about people being treated unfairly because of how they looked, and now she wondered if that was what was happening to her. Swallowing hard, she took a step back. "I don't have to let you search my bag unless you have a reason," she said softly but firmly. That's when things started to escalate. The officer frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by her refusal. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights painting the street in red and blue. Tanya felt trapped, surrounded by officers who towered over her, their expressions unreadable. Her hands trembled as she clutched her backpack tighter, wishing someone, anyone, would come to help. People began gathering on the sidewalks, watching the scene unfold. Some recorded videos on their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Tanya could feel their eyes on her, judging, wondering. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not because she felt guilty, but because she felt powerless. Here she was, just a teenager trying to get home, and suddenly she was the center of an intimidating showdown. Little did she know, help was already on its way, and it would change everything. As the crowd grew, so did the tension. The officers formed a loose circle around Tanya, their boots crunching against the pavement. One of them repeated the demand to search her backpack, his voice louder this time, almost like he was trying to assert dominance. Tanya's mind raced. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to escape the suffocating spotlight, but she stood her ground, gripping her backpack tightly. The lead officer stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his tone dripping with frustration. "Just hand over the bag. If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?" Tanya swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to scream that she wasn't hiding anything, that she was just a normal kid minding her own business. But instead, she managed to say, "I'm not doing anything illegal. I don't have to give you my bag unless you have a warrant." The officer let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "A warrant? You think this is some TV show? We're trying to keep people safe here." His words hung heavy in the air, but they didn't feel reassuring. They felt accusatory, like she was being painted as a threat without any evidence. By now, more neighbors had stepped outside, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others held up their phones, capturing every moment of the encounter. A few shouted questions at the officers. What's going on? Why are you stopping her? But the officers ignored them, focusing all their attention on Tanya. Tears welled up in Tanya's eyes, and she blinked rapidly to hold them back. She hated feeling vulnerable, especially in front of strangers. Her hands trembled as she clutched her backpack straps, her knuckles turning white. Deep down, she wondered if things would have been different, if she looked differently, if her skin were lighter, if her clothes weren't baggy, if she fit someone's idea of innocent. It wasn't fair, but fairness didn't seem to matter right now. The second officer chimed in, his voice gruff. "Look, kid, we're just doing our job. Cooperate, and this will all be over soon." But Tanya couldn't bring herself to comply. Something inside her refused to let them bully her into submission. She thought about her parents, about how they'd always taught her to stand up for herself while staying respectful. So she took a shaky breath and said, "I'm not resisting. I'm just telling you my rights." That comment seemed to irritate the officers even more. The lead officer leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "Your rights? You're out here acting suspicious, and now you're giving us attitude. That's not how this works." Tanya flinched but didn't back down. She glanced at the growing crowd, hoping someone would step forward, say something to defuse the situation. But most people stayed silent, either too scared or unsure of what to do. A few continued filming, their phones pointed steadily at the scene. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the chaos. "What's going on here?" It was firm, commanding, and impossible to ignore. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a tall man in a crisp military uniform, his posture straight and confident. His presence commanded immediate respect, and for a brief moment the world seemed to pause. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard. They hadn't expected anyone to intervene, let alone someone who carried themselves with such authority. The man walked toward them, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Tanya. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. He knew her. And as he moved closer, it became clear that he wasn't just a bystander. He was someone who cared deeply about justice and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. For the first time since the ordeal began, Tanya felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was about to end. But she also knew that the hardest part might still be ahead. The man in the military uniform stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the pavement with each stride. His presence was impossible to ignore. His broad shoulders, the rows of medals gleaming on his chest, and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for him as if they could sense that this wasn't just another bystander showing up to watch. This man meant business. When he reached the edge of the circle formed by the officers, he stopped and scanned the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. His gaze lingered on Tanya for a moment, softening slightly before turning steely as it landed on the lead officer. "What's going on here?" he asked again, his voice firm but controlled. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but there was an undeniable authority behind it that demanded an answer. The lead officer hesitated, clearly thrown off balance. He straightened his posture, likely trying to match the man's commanding demeanor, but it was obvious who held the upper hand in this situation. "Sir, we're conducting an investigation," the officer replied, his tone clipped. "This individual was acting suspiciously, and we need to search her belongings." The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Suspiciously? Care to explain what exactly she did that caught your attention?" The officer faltered, glancing at his colleagues as if hoping one of them would step in to help. When no one spoke up, he cleared his throat and said, "She was walking through the neighborhood without identification and refused to cooperate when we asked to check her bag." The man nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Then, without missing a beat, he turned to Tanya. His expression softened again, and for the first time since he arrived, she saw warmth in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Tanya nodded quickly, though tears still glistened in her eyes. She didn't trust herself to speak yet, so she simply clutched her backpack tighter and looked at him with gratitude. Knowing he was on her side gave her strength, even if the fear hadn't completely faded. Satisfied that she was holding up, the man turned back to the officers. "Let me get this straight," he began, his voice rising slightly so everyone nearby could hear. "You're detaining a teenager because she was walking in broad daylight? And you want to search her bag based on what exactly? A hunch?" The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding vigorously while others crossed their arms, glaring at the officers. One woman shouted, "Yeah, explain yourselves." Another added, "This is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading under the weight of scrutiny. The lead officer tried to recover, stammering, "It's standard procedure, sir. We have to investigate potential threats." "Potential threats?" The man interrupted, his voice cutting like a knife. "Walking home from the library doesn't make someone a threat. Neither does refusing an illegal search. Or is that not something you learned during training?" His words hit hard, and the officers exchanged nervous glances. The man wasn't yelling or losing his temper. He didn't need to. Every sentence was deliberate, every point backed by logic and experience. You could almost see the gears turning in his head as he dismantled their flimsy justification piece by piece. Tanya watched in awe, her heart swelling with admiration. For weeks leading up to this moment, she'd felt small and powerless whenever people judged her based on appearances. But now, standing beside this man, who radiated strength and integrity, she realized she wasn't alone. There were people willing to stand up for her, to remind her that she deserved respect. The officers seemed to realize they were losing control of the situation, that body language changed. They weren't leaning in aggressively anymore. Instead, they took subtle steps back, retreating into defensive postures. One of them muttered something about finishing up soon, but the man wasn't done yet. "I'm recording this interaction," he announced, pulling out his phone and holding it up for everyone to see. "Because accountability matters. If you have a legitimate reason for detaining this young woman, say it now. Otherwise, let her go." The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping and shouting their support. The officers looked around nervously, realizing they were outnumbered, not just by people but by principles. Slowly, reluctantly, they began backing away, muttering half-hearted apologies as they returned to their patrol cars. For the first time in what felt like hours, Tanya finally exhaled. The nightmare was ending, and she knew she'd never forget the man who had stepped in to shut it all down. As the officers retreated to their patrol cars, the man in the military uniform didn't let his guard down. He stood tall, his phone still recording, ensuring every second of the interaction was captured. The crowd around him buzzed with energy. Some people clapped, others shouted words of encouragement, and a few even cheered loudly as if they'd just witnessed a victory. But the man wasn't celebrating yet. His focus remained sharp, his eyes locked on the officers like a hawk watching its prey. "Don't forget," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "If you're going to accuse someone of wrongdoing, you better have proof. Otherwise, this is harassment, plain and simple." His tone was calm but carried an edge that made it clear he wasn't backing down. The lead officer glanced over his shoulder, clearly irritated but unwilling to engage further. He muttered something under his breath before climbing into the driver's seat. As the patrol cars pulled away, their tires squeaking against the asphalt, the tension in the air began to lift. People started talking among themselves, shaking their heads or expressing outrage at what they'd just witnessed. Some approached Tanya, offering kind words or pats on the back, while others thanked the man for stepping in. Tanya, still holding her backpack tightly, turned to the man who had come to her rescue. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression softened as she looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with gratitude. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of relief. The man gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You did good," he said, his voice gentle now. "You stayed calm and stood your ground. That takes courage." He paused, glancing around at the crowd that had gathered. "But you shouldn't have had to go through this alone. No one should." His words struck a chord not just with Tanya, but with everyone listening. A few people nodded solemnly, while others murmured in agreement. One elderly woman stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Tanya's shoulder. "We've all seen things like this happen before," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "It's wrong, and it needs to stop." The man nodded in agreement, his jaw tightening briefly. "This isn't just about today," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's about every time someone gets treated unfairly because of how they look or where they come from. We can't stay silent when it happens. Speak up. Stand together. That's how we make change." His words resonated deeply with those around him. For Tanya, hearing him talk about standing up against injustice felt empowering. She realized that even though the situation had been terrifying, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to feel the way she did right now. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people lingered to offer hugs or share stories of similar experiences. One teenager, probably around Tanya's age, shyly handed her a water bottle. "I'm glad you're okay," he said simply before walking away. Another neighbor promised to follow up with local leaders to ensure something like this wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, the man pulled out his phone once more, this time dialing a number. "I'm filing a complaint," he explained to Tanya as he waited for the call to connect. "What happened here today wasn't right, and it needs to be documented. These officers need to be held accountable." Tanya watched him with admiration, marveling at how effortlessly he took charge of the situation. She wondered if she could ever be as brave and composed as he was. But then she remembered how she'd refused to give in to the officer's demands, even when she was scared. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. When the call ended, the man turned his attention back to Tanya. "Are you heading home?" he asked. She nodded, and he gestured for her to walk with him. "Let me walk you there," he offered, "just to make sure everything's okay." They walked side by side, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. Along the way, neighbors waved or called out greetings, their earlier anger replaced by warmth and solidarity. It was strange, Tanya thought, how quickly the mood had shifted from fear and hostility to hope and unity. When they reached her house, Tanya hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Will they? Will they get in trouble for what they did?" she asked quietly, looking up at him. The man sighed, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but I do know that staying silent won't help anyone. By speaking up, we take a step toward justice, and sometimes that's enough." Tanya nodded slowly, absorbing his words. As she stepped inside her house, she couldn't help but feel a spark of determination ignite within her. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The next morning, Tanya woke up feeling like she'd been hit by a storm. Her mind replayed the events of the previous day over and over again, the officer's harsh words, the crowd gathering, the man in the military uniform stepping in to shut it all down. She couldn't shake the mix of emotions swirling inside her: fear, anger, relief, and even a flicker of pride for standing her ground. But more than anything, she felt restless. Something about what had happened didn't sit right with her. It wasn't fair that people could be treated this way just because of how they looked. Her thoughts were interrupted when her mom walked into the kitchen, holding a steaming cup of tea. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently, sitting down across from Tanya at the table. Tanya shrugged, picking at the toast on her plate. "I don't know," she admitted. "I mean, I'm glad it's over, but what if it happens again? To me or someone else?" Her mom sighed, reaching out to place a comforting hand over hers. "That's why we can't let this go unnoticed," she said firmly. "What those officers did was wrong, and they need to know it. That man who helped you, he's already taking steps. We should too." Tanya nodded slowly, remembering how the man had mentioned filing a complaint. He hadn't just stood up for her, he'd made sure there would be consequences for the officer's actions. Inspired by his example, Tanya decided she wanted to do something, not just for herself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Later that afternoon, she sat down with her mom and started writing everything down. Every detail of the encounter, every word the officers had said, every emotion she'd felt, it all poured onto the page. At first, it was hard. Reliving the moment made her chest tighten, and tears threatened to spill as she wrote. But the more she put into words, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one bad day, it was about exposing a pattern of behavior that needed to stop. When they finished drafting the complaint, Tanya's mom encouraged her to reach out to local community organizations. There are groups working to fight against unfair treatment like this, she explained. They'll support you and help make sure your voice is heard. With her mom's guidance, Tanya sent emails and made phone calls. To her surprise, people responded quickly. A representative from a civil rights group offered to meet with her and her family to discuss next steps. They assured her that her story mattered and promised to amplify it through their networks. Another activist suggested organizing a town hall meeting where residents could share their own experiences with law enforcement. Word spread fast. Within days, flyers appeared around the neighborhood advertising the upcoming meeting. Social media posts shared Tanya's story, urging people to attend and speak out. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers expressed their support, promising to show up and stand in solidarity. On the evening of the town hall, the community center was packed. People of all ages filled the room, some sitting quietly while others chatted nervously. When Tanya stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath, clutching the sides of the podium for support. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she could say what she needed to say. But then she remembered the man in the military uniform, the way he'd spoken with such conviction. Drawing strength from his example, she began to speak. "I never thought something like this would happen to me," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "But it did. And it made me realize that no one should have to feel the way I felt that day, scared, humiliated, powerless." She paused, glancing around the room. Faces stared back at her, some nodding in agreement, others listening intently. "This isn't just my story," she continued. "It's a story about fairness, about treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. We deserve better, and we need to hold people accountable when they forget that." The room erupted in applause, people standing to cheer her on. One woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and hugged Tanya tightly. "Thank you for speaking up," she whispered. Others followed, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and injustice. By the end of the night, it was clear that Tanya's courage had sparked something bigger, a movement toward change. As she left the community center with her mom, Tanya felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Yes, the ordeal had been painful, but it had also shown her the power of standing up and speaking out. And now, surrounded by a community ready to fight alongside her, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Tanya's story became a catalyst for change in the community. What had started as a terrifying encounter with law enforcement turned into something much bigger, a rallying cry for justice and accountability. People who had never spoken up before found their voices, inspired by Tanya's courage to share her experience. The town hall meeting wasn't just a one-time event. It was the beginning of an ongoing conversation about fairness, respect, and how to hold those in power accountable. Local news outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on what had happened. Reporters interviewed Tanya, her family, and members of the community who had attended the meeting. At first, Tanya felt nervous about being in front of the camera. She worried about saying the wrong thing or coming across as too emotional. But her mom reminded her that authenticity was her greatest strength. "Just tell the truth," she said. "That's all anyone can ask for." When the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from people across the city and even from other states. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly by police, while others simply thanked Tanya for speaking out. One message stood out to her: "Your bravery gives us hope. Keep going." Reading those words made her realize that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless. The momentum didn't stop there. Community leaders organized peaceful protests to demand better training for law enforcement officers and stricter policies against racial profiling. Tanya joined them, holding up signs and chanting alongside neighbors she'd known her whole life, as well as strangers who had become allies. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, a movement driven by love, unity, and a desire for justice. At school, things changed too. Teachers encouraged open discussions about systemic issues, inviting guest speakers to talk about civil rights and activism. Students formed clubs focused on creating awareness and promoting equality. Tanya became a quiet leader among her peers, not because she sought attention, but because others looked up to her. they saw someone who had faced fear head-on and come out stronger on the other side. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, when Tanya wondered if anything would really change. Some people dismissed the protests, calling them unnecessary or overly dramatic. Others accused Tanya and her supporters of exaggerating or playing the victim. Hearing those comments stung, especially when they came from people she thought she could trust. Still, she refused to let negativity derail her. Every time someone tried to silence her, she reminded herself why she was doing this, not for revenge or anger, but for progress. One day, after a particularly tough week, Tanya received an unexpected visitor. It was the man in the military uniform, the same one who had stepped in during that tense afternoon. He knocked on her door, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to check in on you," he said with a warm smile. "You've been through a lot, and I'm proud of how you're handling it." Tanya invited him inside, where they sat together in the living room. He opened the box to reveal a book titled *Courage Under Fire*. "This is for you," he said. "It's about standing firm in the face of adversity. I think you'll find it inspiring." She hugged the book to her chest, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. If you hadn't shown up that day, I don't know what would have happened." He shook his head. "You stood your ground long before I got there. All I did was remind people of what's right. You're the real hero here, Tanya." His words stayed with her long after he left. They reminded her that even though the road ahead might be challenging, she wasn't walking it alone. She had her family, her community, and now this man who had become a mentor of sorts, all cheering her on. As time went on, Tanya began to see glimpses of progress. The police department announced plans to implement new training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Local officials held meetings with residents to rebuild trust and address concerns. While these changes weren't perfect, they were steps in the right direction. Through it all, Tanya learned an important lesson. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely comes without resistance. But every voice matters, every action counts, and every effort brings the world one step closer to being a fairer, kinder place. And as she stood shoulder to shoulder with her community, ready to keep fighting, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months passed, and Tanya's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial whirlwind of interviews, protests, and community meetings had slowed down, but the impact of everything she'd been through stayed with her. It wasn't just the scars, emotional and mental, that lingered. It was also the lessons she'd learned about resilience, courage, and the power of standing together. Life hadn't gone back to normal, because normal no longer felt like enough. Instead, Tanya carried herself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could face challenges head-on. Her mom often joked that Tanya had become the family spokesperson. Neighbors would stop by to ask for updates or share their thoughts on recent developments in the community. Friends at school treated her with a mix of admiration and curiosity, sometimes asking what it felt like to be part of something so big. At first, Tanya didn't know how to answer. How do you explain the weight of carrying a story that isn't just yours anymore? But over time, she found ways to put it into words. It's scary, but it's also hopeful. I'm doing this because I want things to get better for everyone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Tanya sat on the porch with her mom. They sipped hot chocolate, wrapped in blankets against the cool breeze. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply enjoyed the quiet comfort of each other's company. Then her mom broke the silence. "You've grown so much these past few months," she said softly, glancing at Tanya with pride in her eyes. "I don't think I realized how strong you are until all of this happened." Tanya smiled faintly, staring out at the street where everything had unfolded. "I didn't realize it either," she admitted. "But I guess when you're pushed, you find out what you're made of." Her mom nodded thoughtfully. "And what are you made of?" "Hope," Tanya replied without hesitation, "and maybe a little stubbornness too. I refuse to let people treat others the way they treated me, not if I can help it." That determination led Tanya to take another bold step. With guidance from local activists, she started a youth group focused on education and advocacy. They called themselves Voices United, and their mission was simple: teach young people about their rights, encourage them to speak up when they saw injustice, and provide a safe space to share experiences. The group met weekly at the library, the same place where Tanya had been walking home from that fateful day, and quickly grew in numbers. At one meeting, a boy named Alex stood up to share his story. He was younger than Tanya, barely 13, but his voice trembled with emotion as he recounted being stopped by security guards at a store for no reason other than looking suspicious. When he finished speaking, there was a moment of heavy silence before someone in the room clapped. Then another person joined in, and soon the whole room erupted in applause. Alex looked stunned but grateful, and Tanya felt a surge of pride. This was why she kept going, to create spaces where people felt seen and heard. As the weeks turned into months, Voices United expanded beyond the library. They organized workshops, partnered with schools, and even hosted art exhibits showcasing work inspired by themes of justice and equality. One piece, a mural painted by a group of teens, became a permanent fixture outside the community center. It depicted hands of different colors reaching toward each other, surrounded by words like unity, strength, and change. Every time Tanya walked past it, she felt a spark of hope ignite within her. The man in the military uniform remained a steady presence in her life, checking in regularly to offer advice and encouragement. He attended some of the group's events, always sitting quietly in the back, but lending his support nonetheless. Once, after a particularly moving discussion, he pulled Tanya aside. "You're making a real difference," he told her. "Don't ever forget that." She smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. "You showed me what it means to stand up for what's right." He shook his head firmly. "No, Tanya. You did this yourself. I just reminded you of your own strength. Never lose sight of that." By the end of the year, Tanya noticed subtle shifts in the community. Conversations around fairness and accountability became more common, not just among adults, but among kids too. People were paying attention, not just to headlines, but to the everyday moments that mattered. And while there was still work to be done, Tanya knew they were moving in the right direction. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks lit up the night sky, Tanya stood with her mom and friends, reflecting on the journey they'd taken. There were challenges ahead, sure, but there was also hope. Hope that tomorrow could be better than today. Hope that every voice, no matter how small, could make a difference. Tanya took a deep breath, letting the crisp winter air fill her lungs. She glanced at the faces around her, her family, her friends, her community, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Together, they had proven that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. And that light? It came from standing together, refusing to give up, and believing in the possibility of change.